So with that, I'm going to go ahead and, we're going to start with Bruce. So Dr. Bruce Bekkar. So I had the chance to share a ride with Bruce the other day as I was coming up with the concept of this workshop. So I threw this idea of coming out and being on a panel and sharing his personal expertise with us from Del Mar. So I really want to thank him for being super enthusiastic about this idea and spawning this concept. So Dr. Bekkar is with the Del Mar Sea Level Rise. Oh, you're going to have to help me out. Technical Advisory Committee, STAC. So he was one of the members of that committee. As part of that committee, they have gone through this process of looking at the vulnerability of Del Mar shoreline and coastal assets, and then they've been working through their initial local coastal plan update, basically their adaptation plan. So he's going to share some of his insights from being part of that group.
Thanks, Laura. I think this is working fine. Good morning, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. I think that after having an hour and a half with some really amazing experts and professionals, hopefully it'll be refreshing to hear from somebody who really doesn't have a background in sea level rise or city planning or, well, I was a gynecologist for 26 years, so, and I'm here now, so surprise, surprise. What I can say is that I was on the Sustainability Advisory Board with the City of Del Mar for 8 years, and I chaired it for a couple of years, and we made some interesting progress, and hopefully Del Mar is no longer seen as being a laggard on the coast in terms of, and we did actually pass our climate action plan last June with a unanimous vote. So Del Mar's off the ropes, and we're hopefully setting some standards and getting some valuable learning on how to approach the whole issue of sea level rise with a low-lying coastal town. And again, I come to you as not an expert in sea level rise. I want to make that disclaimer clear, nor as a city planner. So my comments are those of somebody who showed up and volunteered to be on this committee. And just to give you kind of a bird's eye view of what that was like to sit in on that process. And I want to read, first of all, what at least a paraphrasing of the mission statement or the purpose of our committee. And for the purposes of today, let's just call it STAC, because it's a heck of a lot easier than reading that entire title, which I don't want to read. But essentially, what we were told was we were there to oversee the Sea Level Rise LCP amendment process, to assist staff and the consultant that was hired in the planning process to help the community to prioritize valuable coastal resources, which you will see is not as easy as it sounds, and to provide input to the City Council regarding the LCP amendment. So those were our tasks, essentially. And we decided at the first meeting that we didn't want to meet on a regular calendar basis. We wanted to meet specifically in order to address the different tasks that we were assigned. We were supposed to do community outreach. It was very important for us to reach out and educate businesses and residents in Del Mar, but also to get feedback from them. And so that was something we undertook early on in the process. Secondly, we had a gaps analysis and a definition of a planning area that we needed to decide upon. There was a vulnerability and risk assessment, and an adaptation plan was sort of the final task that we undertook, and I'll talk a little bit about how that all played out. Because at the end of the adaptation plan process, I don't think any of us on the committee really felt like we were done. So these were all issues that we took on. So first of all, Laura asked me to address how we considered an integrated available science. And what I'd like to say about that is that they kind of stocked the pond for us. Here were a bunch of community members. We had 9 people on the committee, and a number of people on the committee actually walked in the door with a lot of expertise. Del Mar is full of educated scientific people, but most of us were just interested stakeholders that had some background or interest in addressing climate change or sea level rise. But in addition to that, our STAC had on it Gabe Buer from the California Coastal Commission. He's a coastal program manager. His expertise and scientific knowledge was certainly valuable with all of our conversations. And in addition, Sarah Giddings, who's a PhD assistant professor at SIO, who was terrific to have sitting there to bounce things off of. So we got some of our knowledge as a committee just by virtue of the people sitting around that 9-member committee. In addition, our 2 council liaisons Dwight Warden over here and Don Mosier are long-term committed environmental activists themselves. So having them there was also really valuable for the committee. And that was not by mistake. As I understand it, the city actually reached out to Gabe and reached out to SIO in order to have people on the committee that didn't live in Del Mar but had an interest in addressing the tasks that we had. We also heard on a regular basis, of course, from ESA Associates, which was the engineering firm that worked with us to prepare all of these tasks. And ESA gave frequent presentations to the committee, which were not only to get our feedback as we did the gaps analysis and define the planning area and all of those other things, but the other result of that was that the committee itself got educated along the way. We got a lot of information. I think there was a light bulb that went off in the room early on when we figured out as a group what 1 foot of sea level rise meant. And I'm sure all of you know this, but I think a lot of people, even with an interest in climate change and an interest in a concern about sea level rise, didn't get how much impact 1 foot of sea level rise would have on a beach town like Del Mar. Most people, I think, are considering 1 foot of sea level rise as being a horizontal measurement and not a vertical, or maybe they haven't thought about it. But when you go to, as I think a few of us did on the committee, go to the mean high tide line in Del Mar up in the North Beach colony and walk 30 feet inland, which is what the Bruin slope of Del Mar is. You walk 30 feet inland, and then you think that that mean high tide line would exist and then be amplified by storms and swells and king tides and things like that, then you really begin to get a clear sense of what 1 foot of sea level rise meant. So one of the early learnings that we had as a committee was to come to grips with the degree of risk that we actually have. So it was really valuable for us to have that those regular presentations from ESA. In addition, staff arranged for us to hear from community services. They came by and talked to us early on and gave us some graphical representation of the historical record of beach erosion in Del Mar. Laura came by from the Climate Collaborative and spoke to us at one of our early meetings. And we heard from Chet Kablinski, who, as probably many of you know, the name is a long and storied career with NOAA and with Scripps. So he's quite the expert. We kept getting teased about Cosmos 3.0 and how it was right around the corner and we were going to get to see how all these things were going to play out. And as has been explained, it's an absolutely incredible model, but we only got preliminary results along the course of our meetings, and they were timed to year 2100, the information that we saw from them, and I certainly have an opinion about the usefulness of that data. It wasn't all that great. And it was a little disappointing not to have that, but I guess that problem has now been resolved, which is wonderful. We had attendees regularly come to the meeting. We had Julia from Surfrider, who's one of their policy experts, and we had Dave from Sierra Club, and there were several other people that came to our meetings and spoke up during them and provided more input and education for the committee as these meetings went on. So I think Terry Gasterlin, who's back here in the audience, apparently asked a great question while I was out keeping my car from getting towed, more or less addressed why we chose sea level rise measurement as opposed to specific timelines. This was not something, as far as I know, that was a planned conversation or a controversy any of us saw coming. But once we saw from ESA's report on the risk and vulnerability assessment, once we saw the graphed tables of triggers tied to timelines, we had already gotten enough information as a committee to see that those estimates of time when 1 foot of sea level rise might occur and 2 and 3, we already knew that that was an incredibly uncertain timeline, that there was so much unknown about what might happen and when it might happen. And this was prior, I think, even to hearing about that article that came out earlier this year with Antarctica's sea level rise contribution being greatly underestimated. But there was a long history that I think Don Mosier reminded us of, that climate science has typically underestimated risk from all of the impacts that we've been seeing, not just sea level rise, but so many other of the impacts that we're seeing have been, so far, if anything, kind of played down. So we immediately decided to latch on to a more objective measurement, which was actually what is the sea level rise that should trigger these various adaptation measures. Again, we wanted to avoid giving people a false sense of security. I think when you look even 20 years out, you think maybe I don't have to do anything for a while about that. And also we didn't want ever to have the comment come back to us, well, you guys said it would happen in 2030 and it hasn't happened yet, so maybe this whole thing is something we don't need to worry about. So again, by using an objective measurement, it's certainly not a simple thing to do to get that measurement, but it's a lot more reliable, I think, than going by timelines. So how did we involve our work with other entities? Again, this gets back to how the committee was staffed. We had representative from the Coastal Commission, and we had Dustin Fuller, who's an environmental planner with the 22nd Agricultural District, which is essentially the fairgrounds. So we had those entities built into our conversations on a monthly basis or on a regular basis. We also elected to appoint a couple of members of the stack to serve on a regional committee that was forming with Solana Beach and Encinitas and Carlsbad, and I think Oceanside's been invited to join that group too, with the idea being that certainly although Del Mar is one of the more at-risk coastal communities in the county, that these other communities certainly are part of this continuum of risk, and we should be all talking about this stuff together. So that was another step that we took. Staff invited both NCTD and Sandag to come and talk to us and give presentations, because one of the major issues we have in Del Mar that's maybe unique is that we have trains on our bluffs, and trains have all kinds of issues, not the least of which is that they probably cause further deterioration of the bluffs themselves, and also because of efforts to armor the bluffs to protect the train up there, that armoring down below causes more rapid beach loss. So we wanted to hear from Sandag and we wanted to hear from NCTD, and we had good presentations from both of them, although I don't think we heard anything we were particularly happy about, because neither of these entities was eager to get those trains off the bluffs. And that was one of the decisions we had to make, and we were sort of swimming against the tide with this, because there's a lot of momentum behind. For instance, Sandag has an entire public works program going up and down the Lausanne corridor, and they told us specifically that moving the trains off the bluffs was last on their agenda. And we decided as a committee that although we may make some people unhappy, we definitely wanted to state that those trains need to leave a lot sooner than 2050. We want them to leave as soon as possible for the value judgments that we ended up making about what was important about Del Mar, and the primary one was beach access and maintaining beach width. So we wanted to hear from these people. We didn't necessarily agree with what we heard. And so finally, just in terms of conclusions that I can draw, and I think we've talked about this, Terry and I, and some of the other members of the committee, there were some lessons learned that I think might be valuable wherever you are. One of the things I mentioned already was that sea level rise measurements are probably misunderstood by most people, and their impact is probably underestimated. But we were kind of surprised that the more we looked at our small coastal town, I think just a couple of miles of coastal town, that there were three very distinct zones within that region, within that tiny area really, that were all quite different from one another. We have the wetlands and the river mouth at the north end of town, the San Dieguito Lagoon. We have the North Beach Colony area where the beach is widest, and then we have a long stretch of bluffs with a narrower beach. And these are all, again, unique to themselves, and they also interplay one to another. So it was an incredibly complicated zone to be in, as it turns out, and that really made our efforts more difficult to try to figure out, first of all, how to address each one of these three zones, and then how to maximize the benefit for the whole area given this complexity. So this may well be true where you are, that the zone, that the small town that you're in may not be just one single set of issues. Also, I mentioned this before when we got the first pass at the Cosmos preliminary data, that year 2100, I think anytime you go 50 years out or even 30 years out or more, given our sort of problem in our society with short-term thinking, you give people too much of an excuse to put things off. So I think the more urgent and short-term your focus can be in terms of data, I know it's difficult to do that, but to deliver the message that we need to work on these things sooner rather than later. And so we don't want to put 2100 up on a slide or up on a chart in any way if we can. Also, it became apparent during this process, particularly when we got to the adaptation plan, that we needed to make value judgments. When I said that one of the purposes of the committee when it was formed was to assist the community in prioritizing vulnerable coastal resources, effectively what that's saying is prioritizing is value judgment. You have to decide, are you going to protect private property first and foremost, or something else? And we were forced to make a vote about that. And we have a 9-member committee, and we did not all agree. We had a spirited conversation about it. And I think some people were unhappy with the way that turned out, but the majority of us felt that beach width and beach access were more important than protecting the homes right along the beachfront. And I don't know how that's going to play out in other locations, but you can't get everything, unfortunately, with these scenarios. You can't solve all the problems. You have to make decisions. So I think the committees need to be prepared to answer difficult questions. And then I think it's abundantly clear from today that this is an incredibly complicated process. The coastal modeling, the various scenarios with different sea level rise, and how to deal with all of this, again, with a relative complexity in a small town. This is a brand new process, and there are lots and lots of unknowns. But I think all of us on the committee are really glad that we got started with this early, and we're very pleased to say that the grant money seems to have refilled, and we're going to be able to continue our work. Because at the end, at that adaptation planning stage, we all felt kind of rushed trying to answer these very important and very complex questions. So I think people need to embrace the fact that they won't have all the answers going in, and you may not be terribly pleased with your product on the way out as though it's finished. But to be able to look at it as an ongoing process and to get started, I think, is what's most important. My last point is simply I look at problems sometimes from the perspective of biology or being a physician. And I think it's important to remember that ultimately this is about climate change. We're talking about sea level rise. Sea level rise is about climate change. And we have to remember that no matter how well we do at adapting to climate change, and in particular a coastal town to sea level rise, that the bigger issue and the more important question is how are we going to stop the process of climate change from going on. You have not cured a 3-pack-a-day, 30-year smoker by giving him a tank of oxygen that he can roll around and go to the mall with. You have to stop the disease process. You have to stop the problem. So I don't want us to take the eye off the ball and think that we've done a great job adapting and we're now ready for this problem. We can't be ready for climate change. We have to stop it. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.